I know my first name is Stephen.
I know my first name is Stephen.
Everybody wants a happy ending. And not very many true stories are a happy ending.
On a chilly winter's day in 1972, little Stephen was walking home from school in Merced, California. It was cold and raining hard. A friendly-looking man offered him a ride, and Stephen, cold and tired, happily accepted. One of the men driving the car said he was a minister. At first, Stephen felt safe, thinking of how pleased his church-going mother would be, but his excitement turned to worry when they drove past his street. The minister said they were going to his place and would call Stephen's mom from there. Stephen didn't know it then, but this was the start of a terrible 7-year ordeal. The men weren't kind strangers at all. They were kidnappers. They took Stephen far away to a cabin in the woods, where he would spend years living a strange double life, forced to pretend to be the son of his captor while suffering abuse and loneliness. While Stephen's nightmare was just beginning, his kidnapper, Kenneth Parnell, had a troubled past of his own. Born in Texas during the Great Depression, Kenneth's childhood was far from happy. His strict religious mother and absent father left deep scars on the young boy's psyche. His mother's intense religious practices only added to his inner turmoil. Things took a dark turn when, at 13, Kenneth allegedly suffered abuse at the hands of a boarder in his mother's house. This traumatic event seemed to push Kenneth down a destructive path. He started getting into trouble, setting fires, and stealing cars. Despite attempts to help him, including time in juvenile detention, Kenneth's behavior only worsened. By 16, he was so troubled that he tried to take his own life. At 19, he committed a terrible crime against a young boy, leading to time in a mental hospital and then prison. 4 years, Kenneth bounced in and out of jail. He'd get released, try to start over, but always end up back behind bars. He moved from place to place, searching for a fresh start, but his criminal past made it hard to find honest work. Finally, in 1972, Kenneth got a job at Yosemite Lodge. He was 40 years old, and he was hoping this would be his chance to leave his dark history behind. At the lodge, he met a man named Murph, who had his own sad story of childhood neglect. He left home at 16, wandering across the country before finding a place he belonged in Yosemite. Meanwhile, in a town called Merced, not far from Yosemite, lived the Stainer family. They had 5 children, and their middle child was Stephen, the same Stephen who would later be kidnapped. Before the terrible events that would change their lives, the Stainers lived on an almond farm, where Stephen spent happy days playing with his brothers and sisters and his beloved dog, Daisy. The Stainer family's life was centered around their farm and their church. Stephen's father, Del, worked hard but always made time for his children, especially Stephen. The two shared a special bond, often exploring the orchard together or going on outdoor adventures. When Stephen was 6, the family had to sell their farm and move to the city of Merced. This was hard for Stephen, who missed his old home and his dog, but he soon adapted to city life, making new friends and exploring his new neighborhood. Stephen's parents worried about him wandering too far and tried to set stricter rules, but Stephen, being young, didn't understand why they were so concerned. He didn't know about the growing fears of child abductions that were worrying many parents at the time. Unknown to the Stainers, Kenneth Parnell, the man who would later kidnap Stephen, had a dark history of hurting children. Years before, when he was still a teenager, he had committed terrible crimes against a young boy. For many years after his earlier crimes, Kenneth seemed to stay out of trouble, mostly because he was often in jail for other reasons. People who knew about his past thought he was mainly a danger to young boys, not to everyone. In the summer of 1972, Kenneth became close friends with Murph at Yosemite. Murph didn't know about Kenneth's dark past and saw no reason not to trust him. They often talked about their childhoods and personal lives. Kenneth told Murph that he was lonely and wanted a son. He said he wanted to help a child escape from a bad home, but his ideas about how to do this were strange and wrong. He talked about taking a child off the street instead of adopting one legally. Some experts think Kenneth wanted to kidnap a child because he needed to feel in control. He had spent much of his life being controlled by others, his strict mother, prisons, and hospitals. Now he wanted power over someone else. On a trip to Sacramento, Kenneth asked Murph to help him find a child to be his son. Murph felt very uncomfortable with this idea and said no many times. He suggested that Kenneth get married and have his own children instead, but Kenneth wouldn't listen. As Kenneth kept talking about his plan to get a child, Murph tried to avoid helping him. In November 1972, Kenneth started driving to Merced, a town near Yosemite. He wasn't there to shop, he was looking for a child to kidnap. He had heard about a family with a 7-year-old boy and thought this child might be easier to control. Kenneth spent weeks watching the boy, learning when he walked home alone. His plan was taking shape, and the danger to Stephen was growing closer. On December 4th, 1972, Kenneth's sinister plan unfolded. Using the pretense of Christmas shopping, he drove Murph to Merced. Kenneth, posing as a minister in training, convinced Murph to help distribute religious papers to children.
My mother would probably want to, and so he offered me a ride home.
Reverend Parnell.
Kenneth pulled up in his car. They offered Stephen a ride. Cold and tired, Stephen accepted, climbing into the vehicle with the two strangers. As they drove, Stephen's initial excitement turned to confusion when they passed his street. Kenneth assured him they were going to call his mother from Kenneth's place first. Stephen was confused, but stayed quiet, thinking his mom would approve of the kind churchmen. The car headed towards Yosemite National Park. Stephen was excited, as he had always wanted to visit there. In the front seat, Murph was worried, but seeing Stephen calm, he wondered if maybe Kenneth was right about rescuing the boy from a bad home. As the car drove towards Yosemite, Stephen had no idea he wouldn't see his home in Merced for many years. Back in town, his mother Kay arrived at the school to find Stephen gone. She searched for him on the way home, but couldn't find him. At first, Stephen's parents weren't too worried. He sometimes went to friends' houses after school, but as time passed and no one had seen him, they started to panic.
It probably took a couple hours before we really panicked, and then called the police.
Everyone hoped Stephen was just lost or hiding, but fear was growing. The whole community joined the search, looking everywhere they could think of in the rainy night. Meanwhile, Stephen was just 25 miles away in a small cabin. Kenneth had taken him there, telling him the old toys inside were all for him. Stephen was confused but didn't question the man, who seemed so sure of everything. Kenneth threatened Murph to keep quiet about Stephen. Murph, feeling scared and uneasy, agreed. That evening, Kenneth asked Stephen about his family. Stephen, wanting to be good, said he wasn't mistreated at home. He even ate food he didn't like without complaining, but things soon turned very scary for Stephen. That night, something terrible happened that confused and upset Stephen, but he tried to convince himself he wasn't really scared, perhaps as a way to cope with the frightening situation. Stephen's easygoing nature, which made him loved by many, now made him vulnerable to Kenneth's cruel plans. The little boy had no idea of the hardships ahead. The next day, Kenneth and Murph had to go back to work in Yosemite. They took Stephen with them, who still thought it was all just an adventure. At the same time, Stephen's dad was looking for him nearby, even carrying a gun for protection. He came very close to where Stephen was, but missed seeing them as they left for Yosemite. In Yosemite, Kenneth did more horrible things to Stephen. The poor boy cried and begged, but Kenneth told him this was how things would be from now on. Stephen, feeling trapped and scared, had no choice but to do what Kenneth said. That night, Kenneth gave Stephen medicine to help him sleep. As Stephen cried himself to sleep, he didn't know his family was searching desperately for him. Murph, not realizing how bad things really were, thought Stephen was okay because he didn't try to run away. One day, Kenneth brought Stephen a puppy, which made the boy very happy for a moment. But then Kenneth told Stephen a big lie. He said Stephen's parents didn't want him anymore because they couldn't afford to take care of him. Stephen was heartbroken and believed every word. Kenneth had seen posters all over town with Stephen's picture and name. Everyone was looking for Stephen, but the poor boy thought no one wanted him. The next day, Kenneth quit his job and took Stephen, now calling him Dennis, back to their hiding place. He changed Stephen's hair color and got a different car so no one would recognize them. 2 weeks later, something terrible happened. Kenneth hurt Stephen in a way that no child should ever be hurt. Stephen was scared and confused, but stayed quiet, afraid of making Kenneth angry. When Kenneth found out that Stephen's grandfather lived nearby, he quickly moved them far away to a place called Santa Rosa. During these 2 weeks, Stephen's family and the police were searching everywhere for him. They even asked for help from the FBI, but as time passed, it got harder to find any clues about where Stephen might be. Experts say the first 2 days are the most important when someone goes missing. After that, it gets much harder to find them. For kidnapped children, it's even more urgent because they can be in great danger. In Santa Rosa, Stephen went to different schools as they moved around a lot. No one at these schools asked for his old school records, so Kenneth's lies weren't discovered. To everyone else, they just looked like a father and son having a hard time. Even though life was very difficult, Stephen only tried to run away once. One night, shortly after his 8th birthday, he snuck out while Kenneth was sleeping. He wanted to find his way back to his real family in Merced. But Stephen got lost in the unfamiliar streets of Santa Rosa. Scared and crying, he ended up going back to Kenneth's trailer. Kenneth never knew about this escape attempt. After this, Stephen felt he had no choice but to accept his new life as Dennis. He was trapped not just by Kenneth, but by his own mind, which had adapted to survive the terrible situation. Experts explain that when someone controls every part of a child's life, the child becomes completely dependent on them. This makes it very hard for the child to think about escaping. By giving Stephen a new name, Kenneth may have made it easier for Stephen's mind to create a separate identity. This is sometimes how children cope with very scary and confusing situations. Things got a little better for Stephen when he started 3rd grade. Kenneth bought him gifts, trying to act like a normal dad. Stephen made a friend named Kenny and spent time with Kenny's family, which reminded him of his own family. But soon, they moved again, and Stephen had to change schools. He tried to keep spending time with Kenny's family whenever he could. Things got worse when Kenneth lost his job, and they had to live in motels. Kenny's mom, Barbara, left her husband and moved in with Stephen and Kenneth. Stephen felt very uncomfortable when Barbara and Kenneth started a relationship. One terrible night, Kenneth and Barbara did something very bad to Stephen. This was a new, scary part of Stephen's already difficult life. During a school break, Kenneth tried to make Stephen help him kidnap another child. He took Stephen to a mall and told him to convince a boy to come to their car. Stephen pretended to try, but didn't really want to do it. They spent hours trying to lure children, but thankfully didn't succeed. One fateful day, Parnell tried to lure another child into his car. When the boy got scared and ran off, Parnell panicked and quickly drove away with Stephen and his accomplice, Barbara. Just a few days later, Parnell pulled Stephen out of school again, taking him on another frightening journey. Afraid of being caught, Parnell kept moving their makeshift family from place to place. They went to different towns, living in various homes, sometimes a trailer, other times a bookstore, and even an old school bus. As time passed, Stephen's life in Kamchi became a strange mix of normal and not so normal. He went to school, made friends, and even tried smoking like other kids his age. But the awful things Parnell did to him were always there, like a dark cloud hanging over everything. Stephen's feelings about Parnell were very confusing. Sometimes Parnell would buy him nice things, like a motorbike, and let him do what he wanted. But Stephen was still scared of Parnell and hated him for what he did. Meanwhile, Stephen's real family in Merced never stopped looking for him. His mom and dad were very sad, but they kept hoping they would find him someday. As Stephen got older, he became harder for Parnell to control. He was almost 14 now, and Parnell was losing interest in him. But Parnell had a new, terrible plan brewing. One day, some people found the bodies of 2 teenagers in the forest nearby. This scared Parnell, so he moved Stephen again to a big, lonely ranch far from town. At the ranch, Stephen's life changed again. It was a lonely place, far from his friends and school. The cabin they lived in was small and had no electricity. Getting to school became really hard for Stephen. He had to hitchhike part of the way, which was dangerous. Stephen tried to have a normal life by joining the football team at his new school, but after the football season ended, it got even harder for him to go to school. He started missing a lot of classes because it was so difficult to get there. As Stephen grew older, Parnell started treating him differently. Parnell began talking about wanting to take another young boy. This scared Stephen, but he felt like he couldn't do anything to stop it. Then, a new person came into their lives, a boy named Sean. Sean was Stephen's age and had a reputation for getting into trouble. Parnell saw this as an opportunity and tried to get Sean to help him with his terrible plan. Parnell told Sean about wanting to kidnap another child. He even asked Sean to buy sleeping pills to use in the kidnapping. Sean took the money but used the pills himself instead. As winter came, Parnell became more determined. He started taking Stephen on drives to look for a child to kidnap, just like he had done years ago when he took Stephen. Stephen felt angry and scared, but he didn't know how to stop Parnell. Finally, Parnell chose his next victim, a little 5-year-old boy named Timmy White. Parnell, Sean, and Stephen started following Timmy around town. What Stephen didn't know was that Parnell had a terrible secret plan. He wanted to get rid of Stephen and replace him with little Timmy. Parnell even talked about digging a grave in the forest and moving far away with his new son. Stephen had no idea his life was in such danger. On February 14th, 1980, Parnell and Sean put their awful plan into action. They went to Timmy's school and took him, just like Parnell had taken Stephen years ago. Over the next few days, Parnell treated Timmy the same way he had treated Stephen at first. He changed the way Timmy looked and told him lies. Stephen, remembering his own painful experiences, decided he had to protect Timmy. He started carrying a knife and stayed close to the little boy. Stephen and Timmy became friends. Timmy kept asking Stephen to take him home. Stephen knew they had to escape, but it wasn't easy. The weather was bad and they couldn't get away at first. Finally, on March 1st, Stephen saw a chance to escape. He and Timmy left while Parnell was at work. They got a ride to a nearby town, but then they didn't know what to do. They tried to go to Timmy's babysitter's house, but no one was there. Stephen realized they had to go to the police station for help. This was scary because it was near where Parnell worked. Stephen was very brave as he walked through the dark streets with Timmy, hoping Parnell wouldn't see them. When they got to the police station, Stephen told Timmy to go inside and tell the police his name. Even though he was scared, Timmy promised Stephen that everything would be okay. Timmy went to the police station door, but he got scared and ran back to Stephen. A police officer saw this and sent a patrol car to check on them. When the police found them, Stephen told them who Timmy was and finally revealed his own true identity. It was a big relief for Stephen to say his real name after so many years.
My first name is Stephen.
The police asked Stephen many questions. It was hard for Stephen to talk about Parnell, but he finally gave enough information for the police to arrest him. At last, Stephen's long, terrible adventure was over. Going back home wasn't easy for Stephen. He had gotten used to living with Parnell and found it hard to follow his parents' rules. His parents were also struggling to understand the teenager Stephen had become, but they were so happy to have him back. They cooked his favorite foods and shared memories from before he was taken. Stephen and his family started helping other kidnapped children by sharing their story. Stephen even helped with a TV movie about his life, hoping it would help other kids escape like he did. But Stephen was still hurting inside. He didn't get help to deal with the bad things that happened to him, and he kept his pain secret. As he got older, Stephen started doing dangerous things. He drove cars recklessly, drank alcohol, and got into trouble. By the time he was 20, he was married and had 2 children of his own. Sadly, Stephen's life ended too soon.
Police are searching this morning for the hit-and-run driver of a car that killed former kidnap victim Stephen Stainer on Saturday.
When he was 24 years old, he died in a motorcycle accident. Even though Stephen's life was short and difficult, he is remembered for his bravery. His family continues to help other kidnapped children in his memory. Stephen's story reminds us how strong people can be, even when terrible things happen to them. He faced many challenges, but he also had moments of happiness. His life, though tragic, made a big difference in the world. Thanks for watching, Secret Sleuths. If you crave more mysteries, hit subscribe and that notification bell. Drop your theories in the comments and join us next time as we uncover more hidden truths. Stay sharp and keep sleuthing.